This video is for buyers buying a residential home in the greater Houston, Texas or Katy, Texas area. I'm a realtor based here in Katy, Texas, and in today's video we're going to be covering the property survey. Understanding, does the land that we're going to buy, does it fit the use that we plan to use it for and how we plan to use it? And second of all, are there any issues that I need to be on the lookout for as a buyer as I'm looking at this property? We're going to be covering 3 steps that every buyer should go through as they analyze that survey, and then we of course can help you identify times when you might want to consult an attorney to figure out details as issues may arise. So let's dive in. Step number 1 is identifying encroachments. An encroachment, simply put, is a piece or a structure that crosses a property line. The most common encroachment that you'll see is a fence that may be partly on someone's property or partly on somebody else's property. This is not a big deal as fences are built but typically don't follow the survey line that closely. Another thing I remember on, I think, the second home I had ever purchased, there was a fire pit that had some bricks that crossed over the neighbor's property, right? Not a big deal, because if the neighbor gets mad about that, in the end I might have a little sore back as I pick up 25 bricks, but it's not gonna like break the bank or really change things, right? When we talk about encroachments, it starts to get a little bit hairier when you have bigger structures that cross over that might have cost more money to build. For example, a house that actually crosses the neighbor's property. And yes, that does occur. So that brings us to step number 2, which is understanding your risks if you do get into that situation, right? If the structure that we're talking about, let's just say more commonly a shed that was built recently in the back, crosses a neighbor's property, if it's built recently, you don't know when you're going into that transaction as a buyer if the owner and the neighbor are in dispute about that. Maybe that's the reason they're selling this, right? So it's important to understand the risks that you're facing in that transaction and talk to an attorney if that event should occur, right? And so there are a few things that here in Texas we'll look at. One of those, an attorney can tell you, for example, does the property that you're looking at qualify for an adverse possession case? And an adverse possession case is, simply put, a property has been used in such a way in a public manner for X amount of years, and therefore they are no longer required to change that property or structure. And so in Texas, there's some laws that allow, for example, a home that's been there for, let's just say 20 years, to continue to remain there because the owner knew that that home was there and that it was being used by that person for that time. Therefore, it's implied as consent. And if they did take you to court for it, it may not qualify to you as the owner to have to change that. Again, talk to an attorney about the scenario. Ask them if that home would require you to really go and change things. The other options might be, you might talk to the seller of the property and say, hey, can you talk to the neighbor and get an easement where it allows you to use that property in such a manner or change the boundaries. Those can be a little bit more complicated because you're now asking the seller to get an attorney involved, most likely the neighbor who has nothing to do with the transaction to get an attorney involved. And so those are things you'll need to consider as you're evaluating those properties and engaging this way. But the key thing here to look for is just look at your survey, understand where the boundaries are of your property, and do you have anything that overlaps and protrudes? What are those things, and are they a big deal? Sometimes they're not, and therefore we can continue forward, right? You also need to talk to your lender if you're using a lender and buying that property to make sure that they are okay with that. Keep in mind that you have a short period of time to make a decision on whether you're going to do something or not with this property before you go forward, right? So the TREC 1 to 4 contract allows you to back out if there are issues with encroachments on the property, but you have a specific number of days from when you receive the survey and when you receive the title commitment for that property, and that's when you have to make your decision. Now, when we talk about title commitment for the property, that brings up a second question I get quite a bit. I have title insurance. Is title insurance going to cover me in case I get sued for an encroachment? And the answer is no. Title insurance does not cover you as the buyer if there is an encroachment and you get sued for that encroachment. It'll be omitted from that policy, right? There's an option in the TREC 1 to 4 that sometimes confuses people, but really what that's ensuring is that the survey is accurate if there's an issue with the survey, let's say they measured it incorrectly and later that's what it's covering in that insurance policy. It's a little bit different than actual encroachments. Encroachments are never accepted in Texas title policy. This now brings us to step number 3, which is you need to understand the use of your property. And this might sound a little bit strange. You're like, hey, it's my property. I can use it however I want. But that might not be the case, not in every case. So there are different types of easements that are applied to properties. And really the two most common ones that we see are an easement, for example, where a neighbor has a landlocked property, and this is more out in the country, but let's just say your neighbor that lives behind you doesn't have access to a major road. They may have an easement that allows them to drive through your property and access a major road. And you may not be allowed to change that road or the way that they drive there or inhibit them from doing that, right? So those are put in place, and when you buy the property, the survey will show you where those easements are. Another very common one, much more common in residential, almost every one of 4 neighbors has an easement for utilities in their backyard. This is where your Comcast cables, Fidium cables, AT&T cables are all buried underground, or maybe you have plumbing or electric that is buried underground running to your home, and there may be an easement in your property that allows that utility carrier to access and do work on your property, and they don't need to get your permission to do that. So when you're buying a property that has an easement for utilities, you need to look at a few things. 1, do you plan when you buy that property to build something over that easement? You may not be allowed to do that necessarily. And then 2, sometimes you'll buy a property that has that easement and there's already something built over it. So what happens if, and then this is a real example, I know a property that I've purchased in the past, we bought a property and it had a big deck built out over that utility easement. Now, there's no issue if the utility company doesn't say, hey, we're gonna come resurface and dig up a trench and pull all these things. That deck stayed there perfectly fine. We went forward, we bought that property knowing the risk is, if they do come, I have to take that deck down at my cost and I can no longer enjoy that deck anymore, right? So this is a decision I made when I bought that property, is understanding that risk, understanding what was there. The likelihood was low, and so I was okay with it. And I was also okay with the consequence if the utility did come back there and say, hey, you got to remove this. We need to do work back here, right? So understand your easements, understand the use of your land is important. There's a link I'm going to include in this video description here below. It has a whole bunch of different types of easements. So if you have a specific easement that you have a question, I recommend you take a look at this Rocket Mortgage article. It dives deeper into a lot of those things as well. All right, so as we wrap up our 3 steps, you now need to make a decision, right? And keep in mind that you want to make sure you're communicating very clearly with your realtor to understand, A, does the use of the property line up with your future plans? If you have future plans, you need to vocalize those and communicate those so that we're defending you and getting you what you need, or helping you back out in time, right? And then second of all, understanding any risks. If there were any encroachments on your survey, what is the impact to you? And can you rectify those if you have to rectify those in the future? Or do you need to get legal counsel to help you fix that, apply an easement to that, right? Keep in mind that when we're looking at a property and engaging with a property, you could get into legal requests of making those changes, but they might not be agreed by both the seller and also the neighbor that has that encroachment with. So we need to evaluate, is it better to go find another property, or is this property really important for you and we need to move forward and work through the legal process of getting the proper easement or getting that property recognized as okay to have that encroachment. Hope this helps. We'll see you at the closing table.